I lost my brother in a car accident and found out my niece is not his daughter in adoption process. The past few weeks have been some of the hardest in my life, but they've been even tougher for my 13-year-old niece, Molly. 5 weeks ago, I lost my younger brother, Vincent, and his wife, Julie, in a tragic car accident. One moment, Molly was a carefree and happy child. The next, she was an orphan. The heart-wrenching task of breaking the news to her fell to me. Molly and I have always shared a special bond. She's a tech enthusiast, just like her uncle. That made it even more devastating to watch her crumble under the weight of this news. She clung to me, her small frame shaking with sobs, until exhaustion finally pulled her into a restless sleep. Vincent was my younger brother, but he was my role model in so many ways. He had this incredible ability to connect with people, always the first to lend a hand or a kind word. If he made a promise, you could be absolutely sure he'd keep it. Losing him feels like losing a piece of myself. In the days after the accident, I took Molly home with me. My parents took on the burden of planning the funeral, an incredibly painful process for all of us. A few days after we laid Vincent and Julie to rest, the family gathered for an important discussion about Molly's future. We needed to decide who would become her guardian and handle all the legalities that came with it. I've built a successful career, and I've chosen to remain child-free. I'm currently single, and until now, never envisioned myself in a parental role. Still, I knew no one could replace Vincent for Molly, but I could be the uncle who steps up to care for her when she needs it most. My parents, who are retired and financially secure, offered to take Molly in. They've already raised 2 sons, and they've done an amazing job. I have no doubt they could provide Molly with a stable home. However, I also believe they've earned the right to enjoy their retirement and embrace their role as grandparents, not primary caregivers. In the end, it came down to me or my parents. I love Molly deeply, and I want what's best for her. After careful thought, I told my parents I was ready to take on the responsibility. They agreed, though it wasn't an easy decision for anyone. They promised to support us however they could, which meant a lot. Since Julie was an orphan, there was no family on her side to step in, making it clear that Molly's future lay with me or my parents. Molly has been living with me since the accident. A week after the funeral, I started taking her back to school to try to bring some normalcy back into her life. We also went to Vincent and Julie's house to pack up her belongings and move them to my place. My parents handled most of the estate, carefully preserving anything of sentimental value for Molly. She'll have access to everything when she's older. Since Molly is her parents' sole heir, she technically owns their house now. However, being a minor, she needs a legal guardian to oversee everything. After much discussion, we agreed I would adopt her. Naturally, we made sure Molly was on board with this plan. But that's when everything started to go sideways. The formal adoption process began, and in my country, the biological family has priority when it comes to adopting a child. Part of the process included a DNA test to confirm Molly and I are related. It seemed like a formality. She's my niece, Vincent's daughter. And then the results came in. Molly and I are not blood related. I cannot legally adopt her. When we discovered that Molly wasn't biologically related to me, the confusion was overwhelming. How could my brother's daughter not share our bloodline? It felt impossible, like the foundation of everything we knew about our family had been shaken. The first step was to seek legal advice. I contacted a lawyer, convinced there must have been an error in the testing process. We repeated the DNA test, clinging to the hope of a mistake. But the results were identical. Molly and I were not biologically related. With my lawyer's help, we dug deeper. We obtained Vincent's and Julie's medical records and filed a subpoena to compare their DNA against Molly's. The results were clear and devastating. Molly was biologically Julie's daughter, but she was not Vincent's. How could this happen? My mind reeled with possibilities. Was Molly conceived through a donor? Had there been some kind of mix-up? My parents had no knowledge of any fertility treatments or donor arrangements, so we scoured the medical records for answers. Yet, nothing indicated anything unusual. Every document confirmed what we believed for 13 years, that Molly was the daughter of Vincent and Julie. But DNA doesn't lie. She wasn't Vincent's biological child. As the pieces failed to fit together, my mother finally voiced the question none of us wanted to ask. Could Julie have cheated on Vincent? The thought was painful, but it was a possibility we couldn't ignore. The problem was, how could we prove it? Julie was gone, and whatever had happened took place more than 14 years ago. Without a sample to compare against, any DNA test would be meaningless. As if the emotional turmoil wasn't enough, the legal challenges began to pile up. The judge overseeing Molly's custody case adhered strictly to the letter of the law. In our country, biological family members have the first right to adopt a child. This meant that, before I could even be considered as a guardian, we had to locate Molly's biological father and obtain his legal consent to relinquish his parental rights. Despite all the evidence we presented, the judge refused to make exceptions to the process. The most crushing part was the immediate impact on Molly. Since neither my parents nor I were biologically related to her, the court ruled that she couldn't remain in our care during the search for her biological family. Instead, Molly was placed in the foster system until her biological father could be found, or until a year passed, at which point other options could be considered. The day they took Molly away was the darkest day of my life. She clung to me, crying and begging not to go, and I refused to let her go. The police were called to enforce the court's decision. 2 officers restrained me while Molly was taken, her cries echoing in my ears long after she was gone. I've faced many hardships in my life, but watching Molly be dragged into a system that felt cold and indifferent was a kind of heartbreak I never imagined. The house feels unbearably empty without her, but I won't give up. I'll fight for Molly with everything I have. She's my family, whether DNA says so or not. Molly has no choice but to be strong. I've been doing everything I can to stay connected with Molly and ensure her safety. I bought her a phone and took every precaution to secure it. Only she can access it, and I've set up the phone plan in my name, allowing me to track its location. As long as she has it, I'll know where she is. And just in case she loses it, we created a private webmail address where she can reach out to me. For the past 2 months, we've been texting regularly. She shares details about her life in the foster system, and it's heartbreaking. Molly isn't being treated well, but legally, my hands are tied. The phone is the one lifeline we've been allowed to maintain. Molly is struggling emotionally. Learning that Vincent isn't her biological father has left her wrestling with complicated feelings. She adored her mother, but now she doesn't know how to reconcile this betrayal. At the same time, her love for her father hasn't wavered. To her, Vincent will always be her dad, no matter what the DNA says. She knows my parents and I love her unconditionally and are doing everything we can to bring her home. My parents are also having a hard time with this. They're angry at Julie, believing her choices are the reason Molly is in this painful situation. Like me, they text Molly every day and call me constantly for updates. I understand their worry and pain, but the daily pressure is overwhelming. Telling them over and over that there's no news breaks my heart each time. We still have 10 long months to go before I'll have the legal right to adopt Molly if her biological father isn't found. While this is a difficult and exhausting process for my parents and me, it's infinitely harder for Molly. Yet, through it all, she's proving just how resilient she is. She learned that strength from Vincent. To her, he'll always be her father. Update: 2 months ago, my niece Molly's phone went offline. I tracked the last known location since the phone is under my name, and after waiting 24 hours, I decided to act. Reporting it stolen gave me the legal grounds to investigate. I drove to the location and brought a police officer with me. What I found there was frustrating. After a tense exchange, the phone was finally returned to me, but Molly was nowhere to be found. When I asked about her, they said she'd been picked up by the foster system and moved to another home a few days earlier. No matter how much I pressed for answers, they kept deflecting. The foster system offered no help either. Since I have no legal rights over Molly, they refused to share any information with me. Even bringing my lawyer into the situation didn't help much. 2 agonizing weeks passed with no word from Molly. Then, out of the blue, I received an email from her. She found a way to contact me and provided the address of her new foster home. She begged me to come get her, and I didn't waste a second. I drove straight to the address she gave me. I know my actions didn't help my case legally, but I couldn't just stand by. I barged into the house, found Molly, and hugged her tightly. Then I led her outside. I didn't plan to take her away permanently. I just couldn't leave her in that terrible place. While I was holding her, the foster father came out and started arguing with me. Our shouting match escalated until the police arrived. Thankfully, the officers were willing to listen. They spoke with Molly about her living conditions, and what she told them made all the difference. Before I left, I returned Molly's phone. Looking directly at the foster father, I made myself clear, this phone is mine. If you take it away from her, I'll report it stolen, and I'll come back. That impulsive visit ended up having a silver lining. The foster family was investigated, and their home was shut down for good. Molly was moved to a new foster home, and this time, she landed with genuinely kind and caring people. While the law still denies me rights to Molly, her new foster family has been incredibly supportive. They allow me to visit her regularly, and even let me take her out for the day. She still has to return before dark, and overnight stays aren't allowed, but it's been a relief to have these moments with her. Molly even got to visit my parents, which lifted everyone's spirits. As for the search for her biological father, it's come to a dead end. We've exhausted all our leads. Unless someone from his family takes a DNA test with a service like 23andMe, there's no way to identify him. So now we're left waiting. 6 more months stand between me and the chance to legally adopt Molly. It's a long road, but I'm determined to bring her back home where she belongs. Update 2. 2 months ago, I finally adopted Molly. After a long and painful fight, she was officially mine. But just as we celebrated this victory, the mystery surrounding why Molly isn't biologically Vincent's daughter was solved. And the truth wasn't what we thought, it was far worse. It began during a night out with friends, a group that included people who had been close to Vincent and Julie. We were honoring Vincent's birthday, sharing stories and drinks. At some point in the evening, I must have said something harsh about Julie. I can't even recall what I said, but it wasn't kind. Later that night, one of Julie's friends, someone I hadn't seen since the funeral, pulled me aside. She told me not to be angry at Julie. Her tone was serious, and I could see something was weighing on her. When I pressed her about it, she said it would be better for me to read Julie's side of the story, in her own words. She told me Julie kept a journal and urged me to find it, saying Julie would have hidden it in a place she considered safe. The next morning, I went back to Vincent's house to search through the last of their belongings. It took over an hour of digging before I found it. The journal was locked away in Vincent's safe, and the combination was Molly's birthday written backwards. That night, after Molly was asleep, I opened it and began to read. It wasn't an ordinary diary. It was one of those journals you get in therapy, filled with deeply personal and guided entries. What I discovered left me shattered. 15 years ago, Julie went on a weekend trip with friends, including the woman who had led me to the journal. I vaguely remembered the trip. Vincent joined her halfway through and stayed for the rest of the week. But according to the journal, his arrival wasn't planned. It was an emergency. On the second night of the trip, the women were drugged and raped. Julie was the most severely affected and had to be hospitalized. The hospital contacted Vincent, and he flew out immediately. He never left her side. He helped her through the physical and emotional aftermath of the assault. When Julie later discovered she was pregnant, they chose not to do a paternity test. Just before the trip, she and Vincent had been intimate, so there was a chance Molly was his. Vincent and Julie decided together that it didn't matter. They would raise Molly as their daughter, regardless of biology. Julie's journal was filled with raw, heartbreaking confessions. She wrote about her shame, blaming herself for organizing the trip and for what happened. She explained why she never told anyone. She couldn't bear to relive it or to face the judgment. But alongside her pain, she also wrote about her profound gratitude and love for Vincent. He stood by her, brought her to therapy, and supported her as they built a life together. They both adored Molly, choosing to focus on being the best parents they could, never letting her see their pain. Julie and Vincent died loving their daughter deeply, without ever confirming that she wasn't biologically his. I cried harder than I ever thought possible reading her words. For over a year, I had harbored anger toward Julie, believing she had betrayed my brother. I had been so wrong. I shared the journal with my parents. Like me, they were overwhelmed with guilt for judging Julie so harshly and sorrow for what she endured in silence. Now, we face an impossible question. How do we navigate this with Molly? She already struggles with complicated feelings about Julie, believing her mother cheated on Vincent. We can't let her continue hating Julie, but how do we honor her memory without revealing the truth? And if we do tell her the truth someday, how do we find the right moment to tell Molly she was conceived in such a horrific way? Thankfully, Molly has been seeing a therapist to help her heal from her time in foster care. I've spoken to the therapist, sharing everything we've learned. The therapist is helping Molly work through her emotions and has advised us on how and when to approach the subject in the future. Molly has been doing better lately, showing glimpses of the bright and resilient girl I know she is. 2 days ago, I visited Julie's grave. For over a year, I carried resentment toward her. Now I owe her an apology. Standing there, I promised her I would do everything in my power to raise Molly into a strong and compassionate woman. I vowed to make sure Molly loves and respects her mother's memory. I also promised that one day, I would bring Molly to this grave and she would know the truth. She would love her mother again, not just as her mom, but as a survivor who protected her in every way she could. I refuse to give up. Molly needs me, and I love her too much to let her down. No matter how long this takes or how many obstacles we face, I'll keep fighting for her. She's my niece, my family, and I'll do whatever it takes to bring her home. Now on to the next story, story 2. I ruined my co-worker's entire career because he was a bully. To preface, I fully acknowledge that I'm something of a Nepo baby, and while I can't change that, it's just the reality of my situation. My mom is incredibly accomplished in a very niche yet highly profitable industry. Her success allowed my dad to stay home and raise my siblings and me, ensuring we had access to excellent educational opportunities. When I graduated college, I decided to follow in her footsteps and pursue a career in her field. Despite having a great relationship with my mom, I wanted to establish myself independently, not just be known as her kid or benefit unfairly from a reputation. To achieve that, I started using my dad's surname and avoided disclosing who my mom was. I also made it a point not to work at her company. In our industry and country, it's common for new employees to go through a trial period, during which either the employee or the employer can decide to part ways without penalties or severance. I secured a trial position at a company in the field which, being so niche, offers limited opportunities. Things started off well. Management seemed pleased with my work, and I even earned the nickname Workhorse from a supervisor because I was consistently the first to arrive and the last to leave. I resolved a few tricky situations early on, so my reputation within the company grew. However, there was one major problem. A colleague on my team, who I'll just call Jerk, this guy was a nightmare to work with. I pride myself on being a people pleaser and making an effort to maintain good relationships with everyone, but Jerk wasn't having any of it. He was openly rude and hostile, not just to me, but to most of the team. Whenever someone got recognition or praise, Jerk would jump in to downplay their achievements. If anyone mentioned struggling with a task, Jerk would smugly declare that he'd done it before and found it super easy. He wasn't just rude to people's faces. I later learned that he made disparaging comments about my appearance and masculinity behind my back. His bad behavior didn't stop there. It became clear that his attitude toward women was particularly awful. He made inappropriate comments about how women in our field should be at home raising kids instead of working, and other outdated, offensive remarks. Despite this, management seemed to value his ambition and work ethic, so he stuck around. When my trial period ended, I was offered a permanent position. However, between the intense workload and having to deal with Jerk, I decided this wasn't the place for me. I turned down the offer and respectfully informed management of my decision. On my last day, I want to say goodbye. Most people wished me well and expressed regret that I was leaving, but not Jerk. Loudly and smugly, he said, "Told you OP wouldn't stick around. Good riddance. Maybe this field isn't for you either." I didn't respond. Confrontation isn't my thing, and I knew I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. I left, moved on, and eventually found a new position elsewhere. My new job turned out to be a perfect fit. The work was fulfilling, my colleagues were fantastic, and I even earned a promotion. I didn't think about Jerk much after that, until his name unexpectedly popped up again. In our small industry, word travels fast, and job applications tend to circulate among the same companies. One day, my boss asked me about an applicant from my old workplace. Since I'd had a trial period there, he thought I might have insights into the candidates. I usually gave positive feedback about everyone because I genuinely got along with most people. Then Jerk's application landed on my boss's desk. When my boss asked for my thoughts, I told him I couldn't be objective and briefly explained why. Intrigued by my uncharacteristic negativity, he pressed for details. Reluctantly, I shared everything about Jerk's behavior. Unsurprisingly, my boss decided not to hire him. I figured that was the end of it, but a few days later, Jerk's name came up again, this time at a family dinner. My mom, who knew about my trial period and some of the issues I'd faced, asked if I knew Jerk. When I confirmed it was him, she was appalled. Given his sexist attitudes, there was no way she'd consider hiring him either. Ironically, my current company ended up hiring someone else from Jerk's former workplace, and she filled me in on what had happened after I left. Jerk's promotion had caused a mass exodus of talented employees. This prompted management to investigate why people were leaving and why strong candidates like me didn't stick around. It didn't take long for them to pinpoint Jerk as the problem. When confronted about his behavior, Jerk was dismissive and uncooperative. Eventually, they fired him. After that, Jerk applied not only to my current company, but also to my mom's. With so few employers in our field, he ran out of options. As far as I know, he's no longer working in the industry. I don't know what he's doing now, but if I find out, I'll be sure to share an update. Since my original post got quite a bit of attention, I figured it was time for an update and to clear up a few things. First off, let me emphasize just how niche my field is. But seriously, the field is medicine, specifically in a small county. This means there aren't many spots in the residency program, though there's a steady stream of students and interns coming through. It's a highly lucrative field with grueling hours but great pay and plenty of prestige. A lot of people asked if I had an exit interview after my trial period ended. I did. During it, I mentioned that the culture and certain aspects of the way the department operated didn't align with me. However, I didn't specifically call out Jerk by name. As a younger specialist in a small department, I now have a say when it comes to hiring potential colleagues. So, if I raise a red flag about someone, my opinion carries weight. On top of that, if a department struggles to attract top-tier candidates because their chief resident is, well, a jerk, that's a serious problem. Now, onto the actual update. A lot of you were curious about what happened to Jerk after my original post. I reached out to some friends to get the scoop. Turns out he's still a doctor, but he switched specialties. Considering how much effort he put into becoming chief resident in his previous specialty, that shift is pretty telling. He's probably doing okay professionally, though. Here's where it gets interesting. Turns out I know his ex-wife. That's right, ex-wife. She was a year ahead of me in med school, and I always thought she was great. On a whim, I texted her to catch up. Over coffee, I learned that their marriage had ended. Apparently, she'd come across my original post somehow, as it made the rounds, and she suspected it might have been me who wrote it. Why? Because, in her words, I sound like a twat when I write. Something she remembered vividly from my days on the med school student council and my endless emails. So, that's flattering? Still, we had a good laugh about it and enjoyed catching up. We're actually meeting again for coffee on Sunday. As for Jerk's firing, I didn't have a direct hand in it. However, after he was let go, in what sounds like a very unpleasant exit, he tried to move abroad when he couldn't land a spot in another department locally. That plan fell apart, and the stress of it all caused a rift in his marriage, which ultimately led to the divorce. So, in a roundabout way, I guess my involvement indirectly torpedoed his marriage too? Anyway, that's about it for now. If I ever end up getting ambushed in a parking lot, as some of you jokingly suggested, I'll be sure to update you again.